All right,
Over to you.
cool. All right, so Dr. Theodora Sutton is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute, where she completed her PhD in digital anthropology in 2021 during the height of the pandemic. Perhaps out of prescience or irony, her doctoral thesis, titled Digital Reenchantment, tells the story of digital detoxers at an adult summer camp in Northern California, navigating techno-anxiety and fears of digital harm. Yet, as a professed technology enthusiast, she balances an academic and experiential understanding of living life online with a deep appreciation of the digital. Before her doctorate, Theodora studied fine art at Wimbledon College and continues to make ceramic art about 90s technology. It's actually pretty rad. And her circa 1994 GeoCities or Angelfire website is a testimony to that. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Theodora Sutton.
Thank you so much for that welcome. That's really lovely. So yeah, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so sorry to not be with you in person today, but on the other hand, it is definitely fitting with the content of my talk that I connect with you through the medium of video call. I'm just going to share my screen, sharing, and start the presentation. Okay. Yes, there we go. So in this talk, Digital Worlds Connection in the COVID Era, I hope that I can tell you about my perspective on disconnecting and reconnecting, how I've approached that in my research, and the some of the thoughts I have for the future. So just to kind of go through the structure of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give an introduction, then talk a little bit about digital detoxing and my research on that, and then talk about connection and disconnection during COVID, and finally embracing digital research, and a few thoughts about where we are now. So yeah, to quickly introduce myself, as you've just heard, I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I finished my PhD there last year. You've just heard that I studied a community of digital detoxers, and I focused on themes of technology, community, mental health, and happiness, which I think are themes that continue to really be relevant with the physical disconnection that COVID has imposed upon us over the last couple of years. The other thing is, if anyone needs anything relaxing to do, I embedded a 90s doodling game in my website at theodorasutton.co.uk, so I recommend that. So, okay, for this talk, the story begins here. When I was a child in the 90s, my mum ran a computer club at my primary school with a whole room of old Macintoshes just like this one, where you could play games and make pictures, but crucially kind of get used to the feel of computers. And at home, my family had a literal book of every website you could visit and a dial-up modem that screamed and wailed as it connected us to the internet. And so my happy childhood memories include computers like this one, and they were very meaningful and joyful for me. And this held true in my teenage years and beyond, when I lovingly built my MySpace profile, or I found fascinating people through Twitter, in each case using the internet to connect me with people all around the world and allow me to express myself in new ways. But all of this really had a huge contrast with this parallel conversation that's grown as I grew up about how technology is clunky or dangerous. So while I found technology to bring me together with other people, like it is today, it's more often seen as something which gets between people and threatens our relationships, something really neatly demonstrated by this artwork. And I think everyone will recognize that general sentiment to put your phone away and experience real life instead. So during my undergraduate art degree in London in 2010, people started talking about deleting their Facebook profiles, refusing to buy iPhones, proudly reverting to their Nokia 3310s, the indestructible brick phone that played the game Snake rather than connecting you online. And in my halls of residence during that degree, I blue tacked cat memes above my bed, and I had a cable internet connection, which was an extra £20 a month, something that many people felt was an unnecessary frivolity. But to be clear, I still went to all the parties. I just enjoyed collecting friends on Facebook the next morning. And I was so grateful for that digital layer of my life. But it was around that time that my friends began to remark that I loved the internet, and that prompted me to look more closely at this tension between myself and other people's relationships with technology. So one artwork I made about this kind of topic was called Deconstructed Sunset. And it was about the way that people take digital photographs of sunsets, and they're really taking something so subjective, experiential, and kind of impossible to capture, and putting it through a process that turns it into something completely new, an array of colored pixels that you can view on a screen. And I believe that this way it loses a huge amount of its original qualities, but perhaps gains different qualities. And this piece celebrated the idea of deconstructing those colors of that sunset and exploding them into a room to enjoy them in a new way. And my final exhibition was called Portrait of an Online User. So each of these were sculptures expressing different kinds of data based on the idea of reducing nuanced and complex parts of human life into facts or numbers. So this collection of sculptures were all inspired by some of the amazing 18th century measuring instruments that they have at the Science Museum in London. They have like clocks and orreries that show the placement of the planets, all made of wood and brass and glass. So while those instruments measured outwards, I took the idea of social media measuring inwards, categorizing aspects of your personality. And that concept came from the idea that an online profile is made using information that Jaron Lanier describes as exactly the things that aren't who you really are. And this piece up here at the top displayed sentimentally precious objects laid out in a grid, like a Facebook profile listing your favorite film, what music you like, and so on, without ever coming close to providing a subtle or interesting picture of your personality. So through the visual metaphor of the graph or measuring instrument, I was exploring the human relationship with the internet and the possibility that we lose something about ourselves when we simplify ourselves into digital data. Oh, and I had to drop this in. This is what I've been working on lately. This is what Ari just mentioned, that nostalgic technology made in ceramic form. This is what I've been making this year just to kind of celebrate my relationship with technology throughout my life. But anyway, part two, I'm now going to talk a bit more about digital detoxing and my research into a community of digital detoxers. Before I talk more about the themes of connection and disconnection during COVID. So through art, I was able to explore my own feelings about technology and this cultural movement against it. But I really wanted to be more systematic and curious and find out more from people who really didn't like technology, what that felt like for them. And so I started my master's in digital anthropology at UCL before taking my project to the Oxford Internet Institute later. So I needed a really clear example of people feeling unhappy about technology, something which was, for obvious reasons, quite difficult to track down with a Google search alone. But eventually I chose to study Camp Grounded, which was a digital detox and summer camp for adults. And I bought myself a ticket to 2 sessions in the summer of 2014. Conveniently, at that point in time, the camp was being really mobbed by journalists. So when I spoke to the organisers about getting sort of official access, they really didn't care that I'd be blending in with the crowd. So to give a kind of summary, Camp Grounded was run in the Mendocino Forest, just north of the San Francisco Bay Area in California. It lasted for a long weekend, so from Friday till Monday, and it ran 2 or 3 times a summer, beginning in 2013 and having its last session in 2017. And for every cohort, there would be an all-camp photograph. So you can see me in this one from 2014 here. I'm just down here. So, people who bought the tickets, which were several $100s, including your food for the weekend, tended to be able-bodied, economically comfortable, single adults who were renting either alone or with housemates across San Francisco or Oakland. Racial diversity at Camp Grounded seemed to be fairly representative of the Bay Area. Attendees to Camp Grounded were mostly white, with Asian attendees as the second largest demographic, followed by Hispanic and several Indian. While there were a handful of Black women at camp, there were several camp sessions where there were no Black men at all. And despite some Native American imagery and practices being used, I did not find any Native American people present at camp. So the rules of Camp Grounded, as well as banning technology, there were quite a few rules that needed to be followed. There was no work talk, so no networking allowed. There was no age talk and no alcohol or drugs. There were no clocks. You weren't allowed to know what time it was. And we were instead given looser schedules, which were represented by things like this sort of chart. That would be the whole day. And then someone would move the spinner to tell you roughly where you were in the day. Yeah, so there were also no real names allowed, and instead attendees chose playful and humorous nicknames, sometimes from childhood, to be called for the entire detox. And my nickname was Lucky, which I called myself after my cat, who had recently died. There was even an analog inbox where we could leave each other notes, flowers, or an actual physical tin of spam. That was one thing that I received, or a typewritten letter. So that was really fun. And so this is me arriving at camp in 2014 for the first time, clutching a sleeping bag that my Airbnb host lent me. And in total, I attended the detox 5 times, twice in 2014, once in 2015, and twice in 2017 for my PhD fieldwork, but I'll just blend all of that together to talk about it. In terms of methods, to study this example of technology removal, I used ethnography, which meant I participated at camp, which, as you can see in this picture, meant dancing if need be. And then after camp itself, I would track people down in their everyday lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. This is me spending some time with my participants in the Bay Area. And back in the city, I would go to picnics and parties with them, go along to their group therapy workshops and trivia nights, embedding myself in their social world. And with a handful of them, I got to spend time in their homes and workplaces, doing the commute with them in their car, joining them on the coffee run, meeting their pets, or staying over on a camp bed. And I really hoped that the example of Camp Grounded would help me understand how people could feel so differently to me. My question being, how come I could have such positive and meaningful experiences with technology while other people wanted to take their devices away? And anthropology was a brilliant tool to study people with vastly different views to my own, because at its core is the idea of respecting different ways of life. So in my methods chapter of my thesis, I really dive into the issue of differing belief, as well as the importance of empathy in research. And I didn't get to see the sociology of emotions panel yesterday, but I hope that what I'm talking about might be similar to what you talked about there, the importance of like focusing on the way that technology in modern life made my participants feel. So before I quickly describe my findings, it's always nice to talk about what camp was like. So it was designed as a summer camp for adults, and it used the idea of the American summer camp experience to allow grown-ups to return to childlike play, complete with milk and cookies, arts and crafts, and lots of games. But as well as the kind of fun side of camp, there was a more therapeutic and quiet side. So they used guided meditations, group silence, sweat lodges, icebreakers or tarot cards to gain perspective on their lives. So to talk a little bit about what digital detoxers really believed in, they went to Camp Grounded as the tagline said, disconnect to reconnect. And this meant disconnecting from their digital devices and reconnecting to each other, the natural world, and their inner selves. And I found that digital detoxing at Camp Grounded wasn't really just about removing technology. It was a transformative event where they found new meaning in their lives. There was a strong scientific dimension to Camp Grounded. Detoxers believed that we evolved to live in a tribe and that our mental health would suffer if we were not in that environment anymore. And they actually felt that they were recreating aspects of the human evolutionary environment by going to camp and kind of recreating this sense of being in a tribe. In a promotional video for Camp Grounded, the counselor called Honey Bear explained, every time your phone buzzes or beeps or pings, your brain is literally releasing oxytocin, which is known as the cuddle hormone. Oxytocin, for anyone unaware, is a neurotransmitter, a reaction in the brain that happens when we do something we like, and it was used interchangeably with other neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin. And in the Camp Grounded handbook itself, organisers recommended giving and receiving hugs, specifically since this would provide a mega dose of oxytocin and lower stress levels. One organizer in an interview with me explained that through the digital detox, they were showing people what real dopamine feels like versus red dot Facebook notification dopamine. This kind of scientific or neuroscientific dimension of Camp Grounded blended with a spiritual one. In order to recreate that environment that their brain or psychology evolved for, they used various rituals to recreate a sense of tribal life and connection to nature. And in this photo, you can see detoxers as they all wore white and were all silent for several hours. And they would write their fear on a piece of paper and then burn it in the fire, both as a therapeutic exercise and a kind of way to transport themselves into the ancient imagined past. And through these rituals, detoxers felt a spiritual connection to nature, to each other, and a deeply rooted sense of belonging to the human race. And finally, the detox had a strong political dimension, since they felt they were resisting the norms of American society in 2017. They felt that their society was broken and that a rise in right-wing politics was symptomatic of an uncaring, fearful, and selfish society. The very act of creating this community or going against the status quo felt like a radical and important act. And in my thesis, I talk a lot about this and about how they wanted to really care for each other, and how it was actually a kind of inward work that they felt was the most important, where they were deconstructing internalized oppression and looking after themselves as a kind of resistance. And I bring these elements together in my research by using Max Weber's theory of disenchantment. So this theory identifies a popular cultural narrative in which, through the development of new technologies, we lose something about what makes us human. And through controlling our environment, making the houses we live in, making advances in medicine, or being able to turn on the light when it's dark, we are further removed from the natural world and become trapped like cogs in a machine. And in my research, I argue that this sense of loss was far more important in digital detoxing than the use or non-use of technology itself. In fact, my participants even used a Facebook group to keep in touch after camp. So during my time researching this group, I also conducted ethnography online on their Facebook group, which they used to find each other after camp itself and to maintain a sense of community after resuming normal life. So the very existence of this group is, of course, somewhat ironic. It was resisted by the organizers for a little while, but people kept creating their own. So eventually they just created an official one. And it was secret, so it means you can't search for it on Facebook. You can only join it by being invited by Popcorn, who was one of the organizers of Camp Grounded. So I found that this Facebook group was just one example of the way that technology was a part of my participants' lives. And when they weren't at the digital detox, technology was embedded in their lives, just like in my own. From the moment they woke up to the moment they fell asleep, with apps on their phone to help them brew their coffee, play them podcasts while they had their morning shower, direct their drive to work, tell them the latest political news, and yes, keep them connected to the people they'd met in the woods. Meeting in person was the ideal, but they also wanted to participate in modern life in order to thrive within it. And in my research, I argue that detoxers were not just resisting technology, but emphasizing creating their own path in life, not swayed by societal expectations or algorithmic recommendations. And using ideas from mindfulness, actually, they wanted to prioritize their own growth and happiness by finding clarity away from digital noise. Oh, and this picture shows you an example of the kind of strategy my participants used to make technology work better for them. So on the left is a lock screen from one of my participants who wanted to really ask herself, every time she used her phone, what her intentions were, and whether she really needed to go on her phone at that moment. And then on the right, you can see a picture of the Camp Grounded founder that another of my participants had stuck under his laptop on his desk. So he'd done that to kind of remind himself of the values he'd learned at Camp Grounded, and to remind himself to take time to step away from the computer and not always be sucked into using it for too long. And I just think it's interesting that even in this community, who went to the trouble of regularly attending a digital detox in the forest, they used technology all the time, and that they did so to facilitate their need for connection a lot of the time. So now I'm going to just talk more about applying some of the thoughts of the digital detoxes to what's happened more recently, just as a way to talk about COVID, about connection, and about disconnection. I really like this painting. I can't remember what their first name is, but that's their Instagram page. I don't need to tell anyone what happened with the COVID situation, but many of us spent a lot of time in this sort of situation, just in our own homes, on our laptops, using screens to kind of keep in touch with people. I last saw my participants in 2017, 3 years before COVID, but I thought of them often during that time. And I wondered, in their eyes, what would we be missing? And what do we lose when we only have our online contact? On the other hand, what is it that we gain when we embrace the digital? Because, lockdown was kind of the exact opposite of Camp Grounded. Rather than being offline together, we were online and apart. So that sense of community that we may have normally felt from our friendship groups, neighborhoods, workplaces, or schools was utterly disrupted. I have to say as well, in 2017, my participants already felt desperate. They felt lost and isolated from one another. There was already an epidemic of loneliness in modern life, something written about by Kate Lever in her book, The Friendship Cure. But in some ways, the stakes were lower when I conducted my research. Nobody was wholly on or offline. You could move between the two. You could get away from your everyday life, go on a trip, get away from the laptop. But during the pandemic, things changed. This offline, in-person connection, hugging specifically, and physical closeness that my participants valued so highly was off the table for the first time in our lives. And I couldn't help remembering the criticism Detoxers had of digital contact. As I've outlined, Detoxers felt that human beings evolved for in-person connection, touch, and proximity. Lockdown would be so inherently unhealthy and damaging for mental health, simply because it was so unnatural to rely on digital interactions. And I learned more about the perceived unhealthiness of digital contact through one of my interviews. I had my interview with Gypsy, who worked on the organizing team of Camp Grounded in a cafe in San Francisco. While we spoke, she told me that she was concerned that some camp attendees had become too frenzied about posting on the Camp Grounded Facebook group all the time. And she said to me, open quotes, "I feel like with the Facebook group, a lot of people use it to try and satiate that need that camp gave them, but it's like trying to get sugar by eating Splenda. You're never going to get that sense of sustained community," close quotes. And the founder of Camp Grounded, Levi Felix, had told me a very similar story when I interviewed him at the Camp Grounded offices. He'd said to me, "Online community is legitimate. Second Life is a legitimate community, but so is eating microchips and drinking Coca-Cola. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but you can be more satisfied with life off of a screen," close quotes. So over and over, I heard metaphors like this that judged a sense of community or socialization online as fundamentally misled, embarrassing, and unhealthy. And I write about this in my 2017 paper on the food metaphor in digital detoxing. So in this view, then, during COVID, we would be spending these lockdowns living off Splenda, never fully satisfied and always hungry for real connection. A 2013 study by Rodriguez Lanes and Guha Sapir argued that social support has been shown to be one of the most important resilience factors in the aftermath of stressful events. COVID then would surely be a time when we would desperately need this real connection that my participants were kind of referring to. During the pandemic, however, Long et al. Found in their 2022 study that social support has been disrupted, for example, in less opportunities for spontaneous social interactions. The UCL COVID-19 social study found that young adults were the most likely to report a worsening of relationships during the pandemic, suggesting that this group was seriously socially affected by their inability to meet in person. On the other hand, people reacted to COVID similarly to natural disasters, where people focused their efforts and care locally. Long et al. Also explained that there were extraordinary acts of generosity between individuals who belonged to the same community but were unknown to each other. Unfortunately, however, this doesn't seem to last as a long-term thing, as shown by a study by Kaniasti et al. 2020. But different kinds of people seem to experience the social environment of lockdown very differently. For example, there were differences between the very unscientific categories of extroverts and introverts. In her piece, Social Distancing is a Good Time to Learn What Introversion Is and Isn't, Sharonda J. Brown wrote, "I don't have more social battery now than I did before this pandemic. Truth be told, I have even less." Some extroverts even became angry, annoyed, and guilt-trippy, she continues. Introverts were, she writes, being called on to help others process their emotions even more so than we were before this pandemic began. Brown explains that while introverts have always had to create coping mechanisms to live in an extrovert's world, during the pandemic, extroverts were, for the first time, attempting to cope in a social landscape where lack of contact became the norm. And as an introvert myself, I began to find myself feeling harassed for Zoom call after Zoom call. And I wrote to my friend sarcastically, "Yay team, let's all get on a video chat together," mocking the endless Instagram posts showing off lockdown parties online. "It's the extroverts," she replied, "they're freaking out." But being introverted didn't always make isolation easier, since we continue to be so strongly connected to our friends and family online. Brown continues, "Introversion is not synonymous with isolationism, nor does it magically make us immune to the weight of what is currently happening in the world. Imposed isolation is exhausting to everyone in one way or another, regardless of whether we thrive in the quiet." So regardless of whether it suited your personality type or not, the physical restrictions of lockdown meant that social ties were necessarily managed via digital technology to a much higher extent than ever before. Some described simply moving from one screen to another. This Twitter user said, "Another day of staring at the big screen while scrolling through my little screen so as to reward myself for staring at the medium screen." And all the while, there was a mortal threat looming over us that we or someone we know could catch this disease, never mind the fact that the pandemic was one part of a frightening environmental landscape of wildfires, pollution, and rising temperatures. And so along the mindless monotony of our domestic lives, there was this deeply contrasting threat beyond our range of vision or direct experience. And I think this contrast is really well summarized in this cartoon, which says, "Shop for a new tie, make macaroni, do cardio, don't let the existential dread set in, don't let it set in, vacuum the rug." And another thing that's obviously relevant for me contacting you through Zoom today, many people experienced the negative effects of living online during lockdowns, especially working from home, getting Zoom fatigue from meetings throughout the day. And Bailenson, in their 2021 study, has theorized about the reasons behind Zoom fatigue, explaining that, open quotes, "On Zoom, behavior ordinarily reserved for close relationships, such as long stretches of direct eye gaze and faces seen close up, has suddenly become the way we interact with casual acquaintances, co-workers, and even strangers." Bailenson goes on, open quotes, "Zoom's interface design constantly beams faces to everyone, regardless of who is speaking. From a perceptual standpoint, Zoom effectively transforms listeners into speakers and smothers everyone with eye gaze. And this ironically, close quotes, this ironically could be an example of too much closeness rather than distance in social encounters during lockdowns." Marusha Yogaraja, writing for Wear Your Voice magazine, explained the way that the pandemic allowed me to cultivate joy and explore gender identity without the expectations and gaze of others. So this is an example of, I think, how the kind of pause of lockdown from normal life let people kind of really think about get some more perspective on their lives, slowly stopping to work so hard on their femininity, having the space to think through the systems of oppression that they were living in, allowed them to identify and undo the expectations that they've been living with up until lockdowns began. So counterintuitively, they wrote, "I am open, I am love, I am free." And like Yogaraja, many people seem to have seen the deep alone time of lockdowns as a once-in-a-lifetime chance to deconstruct the structures of oppression that otherwise invisibly dominate their lives. One big trend during COVID has been called the Great Resignation, and many people are also leaving academia, feeling that they need to find something more sustainable and less exploitative. And this is a decision they may have never had the perspective to make without COVID. Oh, sorry, I've gone too quickly. And this is very similar to the kind of experience people were having at Camp Grounded, taking that opportunity to step away from their usual lives and to gain some much needed perspective. So this is just someone else's picture of Oxford, but it is Oxford. While most people I knew were stuck in cities without a lot of access to nature during the more severe lockdowns, I was lucky enough to live in Oxford next to a lot of green spaces where I could do my daily exercise. Like many people, I got a dog in 2020, and I enjoyed a lot of the lockdowns when I could go on long walks. And in many ways, the pandemic brought me closer in touch with my local area and environment, carving out the same routes across the fields each day as places to think about my work or about the state of the world. And this was not so dissimilar to the way that my participants fled the cities to their digital detox in the forest, where they were able to reconnect with nature. The Mendocino Forest of California is a beautiful place filled with towering redwoods. a little bit like this one, not quite as big as these ones, but at Camp Mendocino, you were inescapably immersed in the intense detail of nature. Every leaf was its own universe. The closer you looked, the more you could see. Frayed bark on a redwood tree, leaves browning on the dry ground, and in the soil I could imagine tiny living things beyond my range of vision, spores, organisms busy world making with each other in an interconnected rhythm. At Camp Grounded, focusing on the details of nature shifted attention away from anxious thoughts and things beyond your control, and closer towards gratitude for the natural world and perspective on your own small life in the grand scheme of planet Earth. Bayer and Spring, in their 2020 study, studied the response to lockdown in a small Indigenous community in Canada's Northwest Territories. And they explained that many of their participants immediately travelled to stay in cabins around the lake, where they were able to hunt and fish while socially distancing. They went back to the land in a way that felt instinctual and protective, which also allowed them to spend more time immersed in traditional activities and cultural practices. But just as in any of these examples, not everyone is able to be close to nature. Bayer and Spring found that those who didn't have transportation, such as a snowmobile or similar, didn't have a cabin on the lake, found themselves stranded in towns where supplies became prohibitively expensive. And in this way, lockdowns made our experiences more extreme, where those who were close to nature saw even more of it and those in cities saw even less. I quite like this tweet that says, to avoid straining your eyes when you're continuously working, follow the 20-20-20 rule. After 20 minutes of work, look at something 20 feet away, then spend 20 years in the forest. And it kind of summarizes the idea that perhaps we all just want to run away to the hills, and that this endures as a constant desire for escape to nature away from screens. So while I don't want to diminish the mental hardship of the last 2 years, many people have described feeling a huge relief from lockdowns. Anecdotally, lots of people who've had anxiety for years reported a great sense of calm. UCL's COVID-19 social study found that a third of people in the UK enjoyed lockdown. Not having to physically travel to work and only performing a professional persona through the window of a laptop screen can simplify things, and especially for introverted people, can mean that social batteries are not drained by the middle of the afternoon. And another topic is that of unmasking. Ironically, while we were physically wearing masks when in public spaces, many people have discovered that they were socially removing the pretense that they'd been putting on in their social encounters their entire lives. They were in fact feeling more authentically themselves with this barrier covering their face and without in-person socialization. But in my research into digital detoxing, I often found people describing the danger of becoming too comfortable when relying on these kinds of communication methods. To think through this idea of relying on social media for our connection during the pandemic, I want to give the example of my participant, Magma. Magma was a white woman in her late 20s, recently divorced, who attended camp multiple times and even moved across America so she could join their organizing team. I met Magma for our interview in a pad thai restaurant near 24th Street Mission in San Francisco. And over a plate of noodles, she told me, one of my favorite things that I did when I first moved to the Bay Area was I attended a pillow fort party. The entire house became a fort. And that was a really wonderful, awesome experience. If I'm on Facebook all the time, I don't get to do those things, close quotes. Just minutes before, Magma had told me how useful technology was in her day, that scrolling on her phone woke her up when she was groggy, and that she enjoyed watching people's lives play out on Facebook, videos of their kids, dogs, and cats. She told me that she was always charmed by these happy little moments from the comfort of her own bed. I leaned cautiously over the table to her and said, "But it also sounds like Facebook fulfills a need for you." And she replied, open quotes, "I value Facebook for what it gives me, but at the same time, I detest the reasons why I might need it. It provides a level of comfort to a socially awkward person, I guess, for me, but I don't want to be that. I want to be a more skilled social butterfly so that I don't need Facebook. And the more I use Facebook, the less of a social butterfly I might feel capable of being. It feels like a crutch," closed quotes. And Magma's feelings were not unusual in the community. Many detoxers feared that social media was a crutch and that their reliance on technology gave them little opportunity to nurture the dazzling cool friendship group and popularity that they craved. Each of them were deep into forms of self-work, often through therapy and mindfulness, hoping to become more creative, more sociable, and perhaps attend more pillow forts. And so in 2020, if my participants did find the digital emphasis of lockdown a relief, they may have seen this as a cop-out, a dangerous vicious cycle that would diminish their potential for a lifetime of in-person memories and erode their resilience to create more of them. They might feel that they were duped by the machine into being satisfied with the metaphorical splendor of digital interactions. But technology did indeed connect us while we were locked down. We did use technology to express our feelings about this shared experience. This tweet on the top left summarizes our shared exasperation with living alone with screens. She says, "It's so weird, people are still asking, what are you up to? Like, obviously I'm home with my best friends, the screens." Lots of people will also remember thinking we all needed to disinfect our groceries, like this tweet at the bottom here that says, "What precautions are you all taking during the global pandemic? My mum is bathing her Tesco delivery." On the top right here, I've got another example of boiled coins, another person sharing their own tips and tricks for keeping safe. And all of this boredom and frustration and fear culminated in the sense that we wanted this to be over and never spoken of again, like this tweet exemplifies on the bottom right. "I completely understand why the Spanish flu was rarely, if ever, mentioned in 1920s literature and art. I do not want to watch any TV shows, movies, or read a single novel about this fucking time." And in their 2021 paper, Glavnow and Dessaint write that, open quotes, "The creation and circulation of memes might seem like a minor pastime, but under conditions of lockdown and social isolation, it might be a key component in what makes the difference between psychological and social adjustment and maladjustment." Akram et al. 2021 also show the ways that memes were used as a coping mechanism for anxiety during COVID. Here are some more of the kind of dark memes about the COVID experience that may exemplify using humour to cope with uncertain times. So on the left, we have the meme known as PTSD Chihuahua that says, "Me in 10 years, cashier, sir, your bill is 2020, and then me just remembering COVID. And then on the right, we have this distraught child who seems to be considering murdering a family member to stay within the Austrian allowance for group meetups. But as well as sharing images on social media or in conversations, we were also able to have many shared experiences online or in the digital realm that were more embodied or experiential. So my routine throughout the first 2 lockdowns in 2020 was to wake up and go straight onto my Animal Crossing island. While physically confined in my house and in my local area, I could make my little character run over the soft sand, stand on the pier and look over the vast ocean, the waves lapping on the shore, the wind gently rustling through the flowers I'd planted. I'm going to show you a few pictures of Animal Crossing now. So this is me on the beach. You can see how beautiful the views are and how beautiful the sand and the waves are. This is me tending my garden with all the flowers I'd planted. That's my house behind me. I extended into the basement of my house and made an academic study. So this was kind of like my dream workroom. So I had like a proper desk and lots of books and certificates on the wall. And there's my laptop and a sofa to sit on and work. So if you can't have it in real life, you should make it on Animal Crossing. Just visiting other people on friends' islands. And yeah, through Animal Crossing, I met a cohort of friends who I would never have spent time with in the physical realm, purely because we were the ones who had a Nintendo Switch. And we visited each other's islands, exchanged gifts, and even attended birthday parties. This was a Harry Potter themed birthday party on my friend's Animal Crossing island, which was streamed live on Twitch to anyone who wanted to watch along. And you can see just how beloved Animal Crossing is for people in the art and illustrations that people make and share. These are paintings of the characters in the game, and they lean further into the atmosphere of the game, capturing sunsets of beautiful pastel skies, or the way that the game reflects the seasons, with the weather always changing, blossom everywhere in the spring, and the leaves turning brown as autumn draws near. And to be honest, I kind of missed that era. And although we can still play the game, there was something unique about that time. I don't know if anyone else also tried the game Among Us, but I went to several Zoom parties with friends of friends where we played that together and had a great time, again, in a way that is unlikely to be repeated. So video games were a huge part of people's COVID experience, but gone are the days when video games could be described as disconnecting you from other people. Gamers often stream their gameplay on Twitch, where vast communities have been built around people's passions. Even Fortnite, the battle royale game that's become extremely popular over the last few years and popular with me over the last few months, transports you to an island of snowy mountains, jungle, and desert. And although the objective is to kill everyone else, the team versions of the game do encourage forms of cooperation, strategy, care for each other, and even dancing and silliness. So on the left here, you've got someone who's injured, and then 2 squad members are reviving them. Here, you've got people dancing. You've got like a break in the fighting, so you get to kind of have a dance together. And then at the bottom here, there are 3 people who are sharing a shield keg, which basically gives you protection against gunfire. So I also want to talk about Discord. So Discord is a site that was founded in 2015 as a way to allow gamers to speak while playing. And I got to know the site myself when I followed the Gabby Petito case in late 2021, in which a young woman was murdered by her fiance. The 2 of them already known online since they were YouTubers, sharing their van life experience. And I have a piece on my blog at thedigitalromantic.tumblr.com about that specific crime playing out on Discord forums, where I share my experiences on this new strange website. I also did this very scrappy illustration that I'm showing you here to capture the site without actually taking a screenshot. And I write in my blog post, I felt like I'd hacked into the behind the scenes of true crime internet sleuths and felt like I'd found my true home. People supported one another in their mental health struggles and shared photos of their dogs. We had turned something awful into a place we could come together. This is another illustration of me using Discord, and I'm trying to capture that sense of staying up late, trying to solve crimes with strangers on the internet. But yeah, turning something awful into a place we can come together seems to be exactly what internet humor can do marvelously. This is an illustration about Animal Crossing that says, gaming allows you to live your wildest dreams. Wow, affordable housing. So at least on that island, you get to have a house and redecorate and do some gardening. And I should note as well that you actually have a mortgage on Animal Crossing. But yeah, this is the closest any of my millennial friends have gotten to home ownership. It's also become very apparent that a lot of internet humor is getting weirder, more abstract, obscure, or even pointless. This is just one little example I could find to summarize this. And the image is of a demonstration of a very precise tool for doing surgery. They've peeled a grape to show how precise it can be, but the internet has gotten very upset about the welfare of the grape, and this person has posted on Instagram saying, "Stop it, leave him alone." So Elise Sanders writes, open quotes, Gen Z grew up in a post 9/11 world. We grew up with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We grew up in the student debt crisis and the climate crisis. We grew up anxious, distrusting, and angry with the society we were raised in. And we wondered, how can things be so bad? Why are people so cruel, and what can we do? Is anybody listening to us? Does anybody care? Close quotes. She explains, open quotes, these anxieties are present in Gen Z memes, whether it's a relatable joke about depression or a nonsensical anti-meme. Close quotes. So for a bit of light relief, I'm just going to play about 30 seconds of a Bill Wirtz song from 2021 that shows the kind of nonsensical, abstract cultural trend that makes up a bit of internet humor at the moment. I'm a princess. And I think about the diamonds in the sky too often. Do you love me? Or have things gone astray? Buckets catch the dreams as they fall from my ceiling. And earthquakes come and go all afternoon. Underneath this video are comments of people deconstructing the lyrics, looking for deep and profound meanings, but even more prominently, reporting feeling deeply comforted and supported by his music. Rasheen Lanigan writes, yes, millennial humor is weird and devoid of meaning, but sorry to say, so is millennial life. And several people have pointed out similarities between current internet humor and the art movement called Dadaism. So on the left here is a Dada work, and on the right is a recent collage. So Dadaism was an art movement that began around 1916 and was characterized by absurd and nonsensical works, and is generally seen as a reaction to the senseless death and destruction of World War I. Elise Sanders goes on, open quotes, I believe that Gen Z mirrors the lost generation. Both came of age during an unstable political climate and became disillusioned with society, which led to the development of a Dadaist style of art, literature, and humour as a means to protest against the culture they grew up in. Here's another striking comparison between a Dada piece and a meme about a businessman with his stonks or stocks going up. And so to summarize, I think that online culture has been such a rich site for people coming together over the last few years. And that's why I think even more than ever, as researchers, we have this opportunity to use online spaces, games, forums, social media as a way to see into people's lives like never before. Just the last section of the talk now, I want to talk a bit more about research embracing the digital. So I've been the TA on my supervisor Rebecca Einen's class Digital Interviewing for 4 years, where students learn to interview participants both on and offline. And one of the enduring assumptions that you'll find in a lot of the literature around interviewing is that face-to-face is the golden standard for research. So going against this golden standard, many projects have been logistically disrupted by COVID. Researchers have been unable to travel to conduct in-person fieldwork or to interview participants in person, but some have actually been pleasantly surprised by how well the method has worked during COVID for the actual data that they ended up gathering. The paper called Looking at the Field Through a Zoom Lens, Methodological Reflections on Conducting Online Research During a Global Pandemic by Marnie Howlett is about someone who didn't think very much of online methods and assumed that they were a second best option, but COVID forced them to move their methods online. And they were then able to compare pre and post lockdown interviews. And they found that their online interviews were very different to the ones they were doing in person. The online interviews were less formal, their participants were relaxed and personable, they confided much more personal information to her, including dreams for the future and concerns about COVID, as well as more information generally overall. And since she saw her participants sitting in their home on camera, she was able to see them in the context of their own lives. One was wearing a dressing gown, one introduced her to his children and cat, and she found the whole process to be more immersive and even strangely moving. And conversely, her participants could see into her home to enter her personal life, while they could also look her up on social media and learn information about her. And so online methods enabled a more symmetrical relationship between researcher and participants, and her participants had greater agency and power in those exchanges. In my research on digital detoxes, I found that the digital element, participating in the Campgrounded Facebook group, adding my participants on Facebook and Instagram, actually created a lot more intimacy between myself and my participants than I might have felt in a traditional or offline study. I could see the posts that were designed for their own friendship circles, and I could see pictures of them going back sometimes 10 years. In the paper called My Profile, The Ethics of Virtual Ethnography, Driscoll and Gregg point out that connecting with participants online can feasibly involve a higher degree of intimacy than any other kind of ethnography, taking into account the, open quotes, ambient technologies regularly used to signal when people get up and go to bed, what they cook, what TV they're watching, close quotes. Since this intimacy ran both ways in my study, there were benefits and drawbacks. It allowed me to see private or mundane aspects of detoxers' lives, which I might not have been able to see otherwise. But on the other hand, their posts were muddled in with all of my personal social media, so it was hard to make a division between my personal life and the study that I was doing. So I think while technology will have been a part of our participants' lives for years, I wonder whether the pandemic will accelerate our willingness to integrate it as part of our methods, not only for logistical reasons, but because it's such a valuable way to see what matters to people and to connect with them on their level. And so to begin to wrap up now, another outcome that I do see while we begin to reconnect with each other after COVID is greater understanding from each other. People have been talking more openly about burnout and about mental health problems. And since we all assume that everyone has struggled with COVID, I found that it's become easier to discuss these struggles with colleagues and that it's become more acceptable to say no to opportunities. There is really a palpable yearning for greater kindness and care. And I think it will be easy for us to slip back into expecting each other to constantly be going above and beyond expectations. But right now, I think it's really possible to grasp onto that little breath that we're all taking and to give a little leeway in what's really possible, given the circumstances. And I guess another question that kind of comes out of all of this is, where are we now with those anti-tech sentiments that I initially wanted to study with my artwork and with my research into Campgrounded? and how have they evolved since I studied them? And I think I would say that I really think the pandemic has made us think differently about this idea of overuse of technology and to be more pragmatic with it, because it can be the difference between feeling isolated and finding your community or like-minded people. I really love the fact that ITV2's campaign against living miserably or calm have been running adverts about mental health, saying that sometimes things like mindfulness aren't feasible for everyone, and that realistically, what's important to do is do what gets you through, with an advert about this dedicated to video games as a way to look after your mental health. I'm just going to play a really short video about that now.
When the world feels a little too much, take some time, tune in to soothing soundscapes, and lose yourself in what the present has to offer you. Or just get your squad and shoot it out. Sometimes your mind's too full for mindfulness. Just do what gets you through.
So yeah, I think that recognition is really there far more than it was pre-pandemic, that technology is an important part of life now. By the way, this slide is meant to be a loading symbol. It's not my presentation being broken or something. So yeah, lockdown, I think, did share similarities with Campgrounded's digital detox. And although lockdown was full of digital technology and the detox had none, I think that both prompted introspection and a reorganizing of priorities, and to decide what really mattered to you and to integrate that moving forwards. Both allowed for new kinds of relationships, some overwhelming, to be forged with a different social setup. And for my part, I feel like my own long-running appreciation for technology has now been mirrored by society turning towards it. We have turned to the digital to research our participants. We have turned to the digital not only needing it to keep the gears of society running and turning, and not only to watch the world burn, but to enjoy using it, to use it to find connection, to rest and recuperate, and to experience kindness, love, beauty, and joy. And that's the end. And that's my bibliography. So if you want to take a picture, do that now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Theodora. Really enjoyed that. Brilliant. If there are no further questions, thank you so much, especially given the circumstances. I mean, in some ways it is a fitting illustration of the talk, but it worked amazingly well, and we'd love to have you up here at some point in person. But one more round of applause from those of you in the room.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's been lovely. And thank you for all your questions.
Thanks very much. Okay, bye.
Bye.